My name's DJ. I'm a recovered drug addict and alcoholic. Honored to be here tonight, guys. That's one of the things I love about Cocaine Anonymous. It picks out my drug of choice right there in the preamble. Cocaine and all other mind-altering substances. You know, that pretty much covers the basis for me. You know, at the risk of sinning against some other comfortable delusions, by the grace of God, loving God that I found here, and access to Him as a result of working the steps, I'm pretty well today. You know, and I know it trips me out. You know, I hear people all the time saying we'll always be recovering. I'm always going to be sick, and I don't get that. You know, I just don't get that thing. I can understand it from doctors and therapists and treatment centers because they're making a bunch of money off us, guys. You know, I'm sure they'd like to keep us sick for the rest of our lives. But when I hear it in the fellowships, it just freaks me out. You know, because of the result of this program, my book tells me that I can get well regardless of anyone. Well, no matter what my present circumstances are. You know, that I could be rocketed into a fourth dimension. That I can be happy, joyous, and free. You know, and that's a pretty cool deal right there. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit tonight is how I got from being a hopeless, chronic, variety, drug addict, alcoholic, to in that position that the book talked about, you know, feeling pretty good about my life, being happy with what's going on, being comfortable being me. My sobriety date's November 3rd, the year 2000. And if you'd asked me on November 2nd, the year 2000, if my life was on an upswing, I'd have certainly said, no way. But I found out that actually it was. My life was on an upswing. This isn't the first time I've ever been sober. At one time I had 12 years. You know, the big book talks about it on page 52 about having trouble in our personal relationships, having trouble controlling our emotional natures, being full of fear. Basically sums it up in the doctor's opinion about being irritable, restless, and discontent. And that was my lot. And then I turned 13, you know. And I had held on for as long as I could, you know. It was a white-knuckle shot. I'm going to ask you guys for your anonymity here because not only am I an alcoholic, I was born a Yankee. You know, I got down here as quick as I could. See, and the deal as I was talking about, you know, when I was a young kid is I don't believe that I caught this thing off a toilet seat. I didn't get it from the guys that I hung around with growing up, and it didn't come from listening to that rock and roll, maybe that one album. You know, I was born with this thing. You know, I had this condition before the first time that I ever drank. You know, alcoholism. Huge difference in saying I have a problem with alcohol and suffer from the disease of alcoholism. I did not know that. I know that we moved down here to Texas. My mom and dad moved from upstate New York, about 40 miles from Canada, to about 20 miles from Mexico. Any of y'all ever heard of Rio Hondo, Texas? And that's quite a move. And my mom's running from alcoholism. You know, she's wanting to do this geographic cure. And I get down here about 13 years old. I'm not real happy about it. I start hanging out with some people my mom would call unsavory characters. And I thought they were pretty cool. They turned me on to my first drink. You know, the first time I got loaded, I'd been down here for about 2 weeks. And I'm sitting out there in a reservoir in Rio Hondo, Texas. And these guys got a little beer, and we're smoking some pot. And 1 minute, I'm nervous, scared, having trouble in personal relationships, hanging out with strangers I don't know. And the next minute, you know, I'm bonding with close personal friends. You know, everything changed, you know, because that's what alcohol and drugs do for me. They completely alter my perception of reality. And I got comfortable. You know, for the first time in my life, I felt okay. You know, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't having trouble with those personal relationships. We were having a great time. You know, I can remember riding home that afternoon on a Honda 50 motorcycle, tipping it over in the middle of a gravel street, scraping myself up from head to toe, and just getting up and laughing. You know, and everybody else was laughing too. And for the first time, they weren't laughing at me; they were laughing with me. You know, and I felt good. And that's been my experience. You know, drugs and alcohol for many, many years was my solution to the way I felt down underneath. Right about that time, I decided I was going to do this as often as possible. You know, because I liked it. The book says I did this stuff because I liked the effect produced by it. And it didn't take me very long till I started reaping my first consequences from that decision. My parents being Irish dirt farmers from upstate New York, they weren't real hip on the smoking pot scene. you know, and they found my first pot under my little mattress at home, and my mom decided that she was going to have to do something about this, and it might be a good idea if I went and stayed with my sister. And she made all the arrangements and got everything all set up, and I'm like, okay, I'll do this. And it just so happens, turns out my sister lives in Hawaii, you know, and as a result of that, I learned to smoke really good pot. And that's what happened with that deal. I go over there to Hawaii. I'm out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The spiritual malady started increasing in my life. You know, you guys, we talk about the progressiveness of this disease, the progressiveness of it, till the cows come home. And it seems like we're always talking about the progressiveness of drinking and drugging. You know, how much I drank, how much I drug. But the truth is, the spiritual nature of this, what the book tells me, is selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of my troubles. And it's about that point in my life when I started getting pretty selfish and self-centered. You know, I'm living over there with my brother-in-law and my sister. He's a military policeman on an Air Force base, and I'm getting in trouble on a regular basis for smoking pot on base. You know, I don't care about what's going on with him. If it did occur to me, it didn't occur very deeply that this was going to look bad on his military record. You know, I wasn't concerned about that. I was like, what about me? You know, I didn't last but about a year and a half over there, and they'd had enough of me, and they sent me home. And I ended up back in the valley in Harlingen, Texas this time, which is a little bit further south almost, about 6 more miles closer to Mexico. Yeah, more, you know, that's what goes on down there. At that time, I got back, I was probably about 15 years old. I met the girl that I was to fall in love with. You know, I met her in high school. We went out in the high school parking lot. She smoked pot, I smoked pot. It's love. You know, let's hook up, right? I spent 2 or 3 years after that. My mom's still constantly trying to jockey around, get my dad away from alcohol. We moved around the state of Texas. I lived out in San Saba, Texas for a while. By the time I turned 18, we ended up in Austin, Texas. And my experience previous to moving to Austin was I would drink alcohol every weekend and end up getting sick. And about that time, my prayer life began, you know. I'm like, oh, God, I'll never do this again. But I find myself doing it every weekend. Same old stuff, you know. The family I grew up in, there just wasn't a lot of God involved. It wasn't like God was good or God was bad. It just wasn't talked about. So I pretty much came to the conclusions along the time with God went the way with Santa Claus. You know, when I found out they were lying about Santa Claus, I figured God wasn't real too. And I just didn't really think a whole lot more about it. By the time I got to Austin at the age of about 17 years old, I discovered the solution to getting drunk. And it was methamphetamine. You know, and at that point, I began to drink much more on a regular basis. Because I'd found something that equalized it out, managed it so I could drink the way that I wanted to. I dated Becky back and forth down in the valley for 3 or 4 years. And then so I could bring my hostage closer to me, I ended up bringing her to Austin so we could get married, about 19 years old. And continued to inflict this selfishness and self-centeredness that went on in my life for about 20 years. This girl put up with me. One of the kindest ladies I've ever met. You know, the truth is I could sit here and talk about all the horrible stuff that happened to me, but life wasn't always horrible. You know, a lot of good things. I had a lot of good times out there when I was young, drinking and drugging. The consequences of it started to catch up with me later on. I'm going to take that back. I'd like to say I never got a DWI, but this is how my mind thinks. I'm driving through the state of Georgia. This is about 23 years old. I get pulled over by the police. He gives me a breathalyzer test. I fail. He takes me to jail. But I pay a $200 fine and walk out of there, and it never goes on my driving record. So in my mind, I never had a DWI. You know, that's just the way my mind works. So you can take that for what it's worth. I have been pulled over and locked up for drinking. I believe in most states that's what they call a DWI. But it didn't show up on my driving record, so it never slowed me down. You know, but I didn't suffer a lot of consequences that a lot of people do, and I don't think that's got a whole lot to do with what alcoholism is about. Some of the worst things that I can remember is you hear some crazy stuff in AA. You know, I hear people say stuff like, well, if you can't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it. And I think to myself, perhaps they've never read page 24. You know, Because, one of the worst things I can think about doing was, I can remember coming home 2, 3 in the morning, coming in the living room all drunk and just laying my little head down on her lap and saying, "I love you, Paula." And the only problem is, her name's not Paula, right? So that's some of the stuff that I did, to hurt this person. I wake up the next day and I don't know what the hell's wrong, but something's wrong. And just stuff like that, which seemed pretty simple, but looking back on it, it was some pretty hurtful things that went on for years, about. I got to say this, even all the time when I never was relying on God, God was there for me. Because if I got what I deserved, I'd be in prison. That's just the truth. I could go on and tell you guys a bunch of crazy stuff, but I'm sure pretty much everybody here in this room has experienced it. Stuff like coming back from Harlingen to Austin with a half a pound of dope in the trunk, and the Border Patrol asking us to look in the trunk, and the guy gets back there, looks under the spare tire where the paper bag of half a pound of dope is, picks it up and looks underneath that, and then puts it back down and lets us go. I don't know what the guy's looking for, really small Mexicans or what. But, and I can tell you countless stories of where things like that happened to me, that realistically I should be in jail, But I always slip through, and I managed to think, God, man, I must be really smart. I'm relying on myself to get through this stuff, I'm a really lucky guy. I'm going to jump ahead quite a ways, because that's just what life was like. I did not know anything about alcoholism. I wasn't even aware that the problem was me. As the years started going by, I certainly thought that other people and other circumstances were my problems. Because if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't need to be getting loaded so much. Those were the kind of excuses that went through my mind. About September of the year 2000, by now I'm playing the guitar for a living, which is something I'd always dreamed of, making a little bit of money at it. I use that as an excuse. I've been over in my studio playing for about 3 days, because I can do that because I do methamphetamine as well. And after about 3 days, I decide I'm going to go home and grace my wife with my presence, right? And lo and behold, I get there, and she ain't there. And I'm a little perturbed, I think, what's up with that? It's about 7 o'clock at night, and I sat around and I waited for 3 or 4 hours, and she still didn't come home. And I'm getting more and more upset, just thinking this is unacceptable behavior. But I've been up for about 3 days, and there's just no way I could just lay down and go to sleep and blow that off till morning, so I got to go back out and get some more dope. I go do that. I end up staying up all night long. She never comes home. I'm pretty upset by morning time because by then, being the quick thinker that I am, she works at H-E-B, and I know that she had to have taken her clothes with her before she went out because she's got to be to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. So not only is she behaving badly, but it was premeditated. So I've got her dead to rights. So I rush down there to that H-E-B and to talk to her. I go in there. She works at the photo lab. I bring her outside, and we start chatting. I start chatting at a very loud voice. I don't know if any of you guys ever noticed, the H-E-B tends to have a police officer that stands out front. I didn't notice him, but he noticed me. And the next thing I know, the guy's over there tapping me on the shoulder, asking to see my driver's license. And I pull it out of my pocket, and I got a driver's license that's been expired for about 7 years because I don't pay my traffic tickets because I'm terrified of police, so I have warrants out for my arrest, and it's just an ongoing cycle. And I remember, I'll never forget, because this was the beginning of what got me here. This cop asking me, he goes, "Mr. Shea, do you have any warrants out for your arrest?" And I'm saying, "I don't think so." And he looks at me and he goes, "Normal people know whether they have warrants out for their arrest." And I began to hear that normal people a lot in the next couple of weeks. Make a long story short, I ended up getting arrested for possession of cocaine, possession of methamphetamine, possession of marijuana, and outstanding traffic tickets. Now look what she's done to me. You follow me? Now I'm really upset. I end up going to jail. I get out of jail the next day, and now I've got a criminal defense attorney. I never had one of those before, but now I do. And I went and talked to him, I presented my whole spiel to him, what's going on, and this guy looks at me dead in the eye, and he goes, "Mr. Shea, He goes, do you have a drug problem? And I was like, yes, sir. I consider possession of methamphetamine, possession of cocaine, possession of marijuana a problem. I mean, that's the truth. That's my smart-ass remark to this guy. And he's patient enough and kind enough to sit back and he says, no. He goes, what I'm asking you is, do you have a problem with drugs? He said, because normal people, there's that normal thing again. Normal people get arrested for drugs and alcohol as well. But I'm asking you if you have a problem. And by grace of God alone, for some reason the word yes came out of my mouth. And he sent me to the Travis County Short Program, which is a program for first-time felony drug offenders. And at this point, I usually like to stick in there. Did you guys know that alcoholic number 6 of the original 100 was a court-ordered alcoholic? It goes way back to the beginning, buddy. I got here, I was court-ordered. I go down there to this short program, and they got a really cool deal down there. They say, if you will stay sober for 1 year, we will expunge these crimes. Just completely take them off your record. And I'm thinking, that sounds great. Sign me up. Because drugs are bad. Right? This is a cool deal. And they got this little fine print right down at the bottom that says, no alcohol. Exactly. I'm like, uh-oh. And but I'm thinking I can outsmart these guys. Because I got a lot of friends who are on probation. I've already envisioning the routine, peeing in the little cup, drinking the stuff and all this. I mean, I got some pro friends that I'm going to ask how to get through this. And see, but they're pretty rigorous there at the short program. See, they want you to go to 3 groups a week, 3 AA meetings a week, 2 groups a week, intensive outpatient, random urinalysis twice a week, drug court once every 3 weeks, all kinds of silly stuff like that. Because they're going to catch you if you're using. But I'm still thinking I can outsmart these guys. And I didn't do so well. I didn't go to any of those A&A meetings. I didn't go to those groups. I ended up in intensive outpatient about 3 days late. And I walk in there, and this lady walks up to me with a big old smile. Her name's Pam. And she goes, hi, my name's Pam. What's your drug of choice? And I looked at her and I said, what do you got? And I thought she was offering to get high. I was like, this intensive outpatient ain't going to be too bad. They're sticking all us druggies together. She went on to explain to me of what drug of choice meant. And I'm like, I'm not a choosy guy. And you don't understand. And finally she's like, no, DJ, what do you want to do right now worse than anything? And I was like, I want to go back out my truck and finish that half a beer I was drinking on the way here. And she turned out to be my case manager. That was my first experience in the rooms of recovery. And she made me sit right next to her. I couldn't get a dry date on the outside, guys. I mean, I needed to. The book talks about giving sufficient reason. I have signed a piece of paper that says, if I can't stay sober for a year, please lock me up. And that's the gist of the contract. Please lock me up if I can't do this. I'm going to take a UA, which is in North Austin, and I'm drinking alcohol from 3 beers on the way to do it. I don't know anything about mental obsession, loss of power of choice, but I'm smart enough to know there's probably something wrong with that. But here I am doing that. I end up going to court for the first time, and this judge just looked at me, and the next thing I knew, the next day I was an inpatient. I got my first trip out to Kerrville, the hill country. And that was November 3rd, the year 2000. I got there to, I kind of thought rehab was going to be like they were going to lock you in a little rubber room for 30 days and then just turn you loose. So I had brought my guitar, my Star Wars books. Kind of figured, they were going to take my Led Zeppelin albums away from me, but I could handle that. And damn, I was surprised when I got there. They had all kinds of shit they wanted me to do. The first one was to get up. Because I finished my stuff off going up the driveway. Got my first resentment when I got there because there was another guy came in more loaded than me. Because I'm going in there trying to keep it together like I think I'm hiding it from somebody, right? And this other guy comes in really squashed, and I'm like, you can come in here like that? Yeah. But they already had me by that time. Everybody driven away. I'm sitting down there in SCU, and I'll never forget, people talk about your last drunk. If there's one thing that I hope I never do forget, it's what those first 2 or 3 days of sobriety were like. Because I can remember those pretty well. They were not fun. I don't think that's going to keep me sober. It's what the book talks about on 24, you know. It's what about losing the power of choice is about. I took a guy out to detox today, you know. I've heard people say that, you know, I see other people drunk and I need to see that because that's going to keep me sober. It's like, I don't think for a minute that watching your pain and suffering is going to help keep me sober. Because my own pain and suffering wouldn't even keep me sober. If seeing somebody else down and out, drunk and puking and miserable would have got me sober, I'd have been sober a long time before I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I can assure you. Because plenty of my friends have been doing that for many years. That was a weekend event, you know. That was like Sunday night. But I get down there to SCU, and I'm still sitting there on this little bench smoking cigarettes, staring through some bushes, thinking, and I can smell the alcohol at the store a mile away, you know. I can make it, you know. I could crawl through these bushes, and I could come back, and none of these people would know. And by, again, you know, I have to think of the grace of a loving God. I decided maybe that wasn't too good of an idea, and I went back in there and went to sleep. And about 3 days later, I got to say this one thing. I met this guy. I'll never forget him. I only knew him for about 5 days, but this guy did me one of the best turns in the world. I call him Smiling Jack because he was a very miserable guy. He was coming down off heroin. And one of the things Smiling Jack said to me was he looked over there at this long line of people, and he said, "You see that line over there?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "That's the med window." He said, "You stay out of that line because those people are drug pushers. You will come out of here with more habits than you came in here with." And so I detoxed without any meds. And I'm grateful to that guy for me. That's just how it worked for me. I mean, I'd come down off... Detox was not a strange thing to me. I'd been doing it for years, you know. I went in, crashed for a couple days, woke up. And they drugged me up to the community room. And I start hearing this guy talk. And I got no idea what he's talking about. You know, he seems pretty excited about something. And I'm thinking, you know, after a couple days of listening to him, you know, this guy is either on something, you know, he's crazier than I am, or perhaps, you know, he's on to something. And just that small part of an idea of perhaps he was on to something, I started listening to him. And after a couple of days, I finally reached out the courage enough to raise my hand and ask this guy a question, you know, that is what you're telling me. If I read this book and I go to your happy-ass AA meetings and get a sponsor and work these steps, because I still haven't been to an AA meeting yet, you know, and I work these steps and I pray and I try to help somebody else, that this feeling I got inside right now that I want to drink worse than I want to breathe is going to go away. And he told me that was exactly right. So I started paying a little more attention. I started reading the big book. First thing that stepped out of me in that book was on page 22. Because I remember reading about the real alcoholic. You guys have all read that. The guy on page 21, right? Talks about how horrible it is, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the guy's drinking all night, and he can't get up and go to work the next day. And first time I read that through, I was thinking, man, I'm lucky. This guy's really sick. You know, this guy's pretty bad. And I look over there on page 22 and see that last line is what stepped up to me. It says that he then begins to appear at hospitals and sanitariums. And I read that line, and there's two guys sitting about 10 feet away from me talking about how many times they've been in that treatment center. One of them was like 6, and one of them was like 5, like they were going for the record or something. And I look back at that word, begins. You know, yeah, buddy, it wasn't the hospitals and sanitariums that scared me. It was the word begins. See, because this becomes a way of life for us. You guys have all heard that. Hospitals, institutions, death. You know. And here I am, beginning the weary rounds of institutions for the first time in my life. And that snapped me out a little bit. I started paying a little bit more attention to this book. And this guy started talking about a thing about the 3-part disease of alcoholism, body, mind, and spirit. And the first thing I was able to grab a hold of was this body thing. You know, I started relating to stuff where how the reaction of drugs and alcohol in my body was different than how it was for normal people. And one of the things I thought about was like with my ex-wife Becky, you know, I'd go out and score a gram of speed. We'd get high for a couple days, and I'd sleep it off for a couple days. And about 2 weeks later, we go out camping, and Becky pulls out this little 1/4 gram of speed that she saved from that night. And I'm thinking, like, how in the hell did she do that? You know, I just don't get it. And then we start doing the speed, and then I'm angry because, for one thing, she was holding out on me, and now she hadn't brought enough to really get me high. And about 6 hours later, I'm ready to go back to town because I need some more. Camping's over. Right? You know, because my body reacts differently than normal people. And when I became honest enough with how it affected me, was I able to control it once I put it into my body and compare myself to other people, because the book says that this reaction, this allergic reaction, sets us apart as a completely different entity. In other words, normal people don't ever experience that, you know. And I began to look back at my own truth and see my own experience. And I could relate to those things. I don't know how many times I was going to come home and buy a couple of beers, maybe a six-pack, you know, just a six-pack. I'm just going to drink those, call it an evening. And then I get home and I change my mind. You know, because that's what I thought about this thing of, I looked back, I changed my mind a lot. You know, I'm going to go over and score a half a gram of cocaine. I do that, I come home, I get home, I change my mind. You know, I'm going to go back over there and score me an 8-ball. I do a lot of change in my mind, and that's how I was able to identify with this physical craving. A little bit later on, you know, he started talking about this thing about the power of choice, the mental obsession, the mind piece of this deal. And I was able to relate to some of my experience about going to take that urinalysis and drinking on the way there. You know, the book says if given a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, falling in love, warning of a doctor, I would think going to a penitentiary and meeting Bubba, you know, something like that might be a sufficient reason for me to stop using. And I've had all those reasons, but none of that stuff ever stopped me. You know, I just blew right on past that stuff. And so I was able to grasp that deal about the mental obsession. The book says the great obsession of every abnormal drinker is the idea that someday he will control and enjoy his drinking, drugging. You know, and I don't know about you guys, but if I'm controlling it, I am not enjoying it. And if I am enjoying it, I sure as hell am not controlling it. You know, and that's just been my experience all my life. And again, you know, what I was asked to do and question myself was to look back on my own truth. Could I find these things in myself? Because this is about a lot more than just admitting I was an alcoholic. If you'd have asked me the first day, you'd have asked me 5 years before I ever got sober if I was an alcoholic, I'd have probably told you, sure. My last name's Shea. You know, we come from Ireland. Right? But the deal is, I didn't know what an alcoholic was. It was just verbiage. You know, until I understood what the disease of alcoholism was, I just stayed drunk. Because I didn't understand what that meant. If simply admitting that I was an alcoholic and I was powerless over alcohol and drugs, my life was unmanageable, was as simple as the first step was, it'd be on page number 1 in the big book instead of page 58. You know, Bill Wilson talks about a lot of other stuff that I've got to compare myself to before I get to that point. And that's what that admission is, understanding that I've got this illness. And then the one that became apparently clearer and clearer was when he started talking about the spiritual piece. Like, DJ, are you irritable, restless, and discontent? No, why do you ask? You know, stuff like that. And I began to look at myself. How did I feel? Because, guys, the truth is, that's always been my enemy. Sobriety is the enemy, not drinking and drugging. Because when I get sober is when I get uncomfortable. The pain comes. I start to have these feelings of fear, anxiety. My mind starts racing. You know, if you catch me when I'm loaded, you know, I'm not having trouble in personal relationships. I'll give you some advice on yours if you want. You know, I don't have those unnatural things. The problem is sometimes I get too loaded. I get into trouble. And as it progressed throughout my life, it got to be toward the end where I needed to stay loaded all the time just to live in my skin. And that ain't right. You know, so for the first time in a long time, I'm sitting in this treatment center, and I got a week or two of sobriety behind me. And I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't happy, joyous, and free. You know, I was pretty damn uncomfortable. And I wasn't liking it a whole lot. And this stuff started making a hell of a lot of sense to me. You know, I spent 28 days there, but I learned what alcoholism was. A disease of the mind, the body, and the spirit. And I learned that I had it. And I knew that when I left there, I was going to drink no matter if I wanted to or not. See, that's the deal with alcoholism. It's got nothing to do with what I want, whether I believe in God, how much I believe, how much faith I've got. I'm going to do this stuff whether I believe it or not. But these guys had given me a little bit of hope, and they told me that if I worked these 12 steps, that I wouldn't have to do that. And I can't sit here and tell you that I believed those guys. I hoped that they were right, but I did not necessarily believe it. But I didn't have anything to lose. I was in Alcoholics Anonymous within 24 hours of getting out of treatment. 3 days later, I had a sponsor. And he talked to me about the first, second step, asked me about the third step. I told him I didn't know what it was or how to do it. And he read the book with me, had me get down on my knees for the first time the next morning, say my third step prayer, meet him over at his house, and we'll get busy on a fourth step. This is 3 days out of treatment, guys. I'm working on a fourth step. I worked on that thing for 2 weeks, 2 hours a day. He told me when I was going to be done with it, when I started it. You know, it wasn't no, call me when you're done. He's like, you're going to start on it today. You're going to work on it for 2 hours a day. In 2 weeks, we're going to do a fifth step. Call me every day. Go to a meeting every day. I'm going to like 5 meetings a day because I'm basically a nut, right? And that was my experience in early sobriety. Early sobriety was not necessarily a picnic for me, you know. When I got over there December 18th, my sobriety date's November 3rd, so you can do the math yourself. December 18th of the year 2000, I get over to this guy's house and I do a fifth step. And I'm riding home from this guy's house to go do 6 and 7, the way it's outlined in the book. And for the first time in my adult life, do I not want to drink or drug. You know, like that. The obsession was lifted from me and has never returned. You know, I didn't know what that was going to feel like. You know, they explained it to me, but for the first time I realized it when I was riding home on the way home, and I stopped to get a pack of cigarettes in a 7-Eleven, and I walk in there, and there's those frosty cold beers in the cooler, and they're back there and everything. Guys out in the corner smoking dope and all this stuff, and it occurs to me, I don't want it. I feel okay the way that I am. And that's the first time I've ever felt that way in my life. And I'm loving it. I go home, I do 6 and 7. I began to have a spiritual experience. The book says we may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but at this point we begin to have a spiritual experience. And I don't know about you guys, but not wanting to have dope, to do dope and alcohol is a pretty powerful experience to me. You know, I continued to go forward in this work. I did steps 8, I did steps 9. 9 is when things really started to happen for me. As far as my relationship with God began to develop. I had one guy that I dreaded this amend. They had me line my amends up in yes, no's, yeses, no, maybes, and no's. Nevers, right? Yes, maybe, and never. 3 categories. I do all the yeses first. The maybes turn into yeses. The nevers turn into maybes. Then I do all them. So finally I'm working my way up to those hard ones, right? And I'm dreading going over to this guy's house who had helped me work on my CD. Because he'd helped me do the CD. I'd been working on his house. And I had his upper deck just torn to pieces because we were going to do some work on his house and raise some money for the next CD. And that's the way my life is, you know. Vinny ends up going back to prison. He's a singer in the band. The band's not going anywhere, so I just disappear off the face of the earth. And that's my MO, you know. Something happens with somebody, I just don't ever see that person again. You know, so I got a lot of that stuff in my past. I'm going over there to this guy's house, the last person in the world I want to walk up to. And I'm sitting there saying this 3rd step prayer, saying this 7th step prayer, hoping that this stuff's going to come true, going to the last place on the face of the earth that I want to be. I get up, I knock on this guy's door. He opens the door up, and he goes, "Hi, DJ." He goes, "I was praying this morning. Who's going to come over and help me finish that deck?" And that blew me away. See, it had been over a year since I'd been there. And this guy and he let me come in, finish the deck up. It was pretty simple. See, and then the deal was, the truth to me is, this guy was a nice Christian man. You know, he wasn't kidding when he said he was praying that morning how he was going to get this stuff fixed. And that's the day that I'd show up, you know. And I began to see that this stuff was all connected. And the things that they were talking about in this book were the truth. You know. As far as being hunky-dory and la-la land, my first year of sobriety was not hunky-dory, buddy. You know, I experienced divorce. My wife left about 90 days out with another guy. And see, I thought I wanted to drink over that. If you'd asked me the worst thing that I could possibly imagine, I thought I would drink, I thought that would be it. So I find myself in a 7-Eleven, walking in there because I'm going to drink. And I get up to the cooler, and I find that I cannot take the beer out of the cooler. So I'm standing in a 7-Eleven crying because I don't know if it's because my wife's gone with another man or because I can't drink over it. This guy, this 7-Eleven guy sitting there staring at me like he's worried about, guard the money, call the cops. This guy's a nut. I leave the place, I'm riding home, and I start crying again because suddenly I realized God had done for me what I could not do for myself. See, it talks about it on page 57. That save for a few brief moments of temptation, the thought of drink had never returned to this man. And when it did, a great revulsion rose up in him. And seemingly he could not drink even if he would. And see, that's the kind of power I had been seeking. The 10th step tells me that. That I will recoil from this stuff as if from a hot flame. Sanity will have returned. And the cool part about it, guys, is it says in that part of the promise, it will take no thought or effort on my part. It just comes. That is the miracle of this program. Because if it required my thoughts and me relying on myself to stay sober, that's what I could never do. I would have never had to come to Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, and work these steps and get hooked into this power. Because I had a belief in God before I got here. I believed. I had prayed many times. But what I didn't have was access to this power that keeps me sober today. And I got that as a result of doing this work. Probably a couple months later, I'm going to an AA club. Actually, I moved my stuff out of my house into my studio because I'm thinking there's probably not enough room there for me, Becky, and her boyfriend. So I move into my studio, right? And I end up breaking my ankle. And this is still my first 4 or 5 months. So now I can't pay my rent. I can't work. I don't have a job. I'm losing my place to live. My wife's gone with another man. And I'm thinking, hey, I could feel pretty sorry for myself over this, right? Maybe I should go to a meeting and whine. But thank God that I had gotten guidance from guys in this program that taught me how to do this. And so I was willing. See, it talks about it on page 133. When trouble comes, we cheerfully capitalize on it as an opportunity to demonstrate His omnipotence. Tallest order in the book. And I'm thinking, shit, it's hitting the fan here. But I'm going to go in there to this meeting, and I get in there, and nobody's chairing the meeting. The meeting's 5 minutes late. So I decide I'm going to go chair this little meeting. I get up there, I chair the meeting. By the end of the meeting, some guy comes up to me and asks me to sponsor him. I'm like, okay. We go back in this little room back here, and it turns out that the next day, he's going into treatment for 90 days. And he needs somebody to watch his house. And see, and that's what I've found over and over and over again in this program. When I became willing to look out for you guys, God's got my back. And that's what this triangle's about. It's about me helping you get to God, God taking care of me. And I've experienced that over and over again. I got the privilege after that to go work with my family on the road for a year. And one thing I'll tell you guys I'm real grateful for is recovery in Texas is pretty darn good. Because there was places out there it was scary. No big books. But I went anyways. And I tried to bring something to those meetings because that's what they taught me. That it's what I brought to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, Cocaine Anonymous meeting, not what I took away from it. They taught me to clean up ashtrays. And I've heard people say that, well, where's that in the book, DJ? And I open that book up to page 20, and that's where it's at. It says, as ex-problem drinkers, our very lives depend on our constant thought of others and how we may help meet their needs. They taught me to pick up chairs. I hope that I never get so well that I stop picking up chairs and picking up ashtrays, because when I do, that's the day I'll go out again. I get out there on the road, and again, it's a pretty lonely time in my life. I'm working for my family. I'm feeling a little bad for myself. It's my 2-year birthday. I'm going to go to a meeting, and I'm going to get me my chip. And I show up at this meeting, and it's me and 2 newcomers. And they ain't got no chips. And I end up chairing the meeting, giving it and talking to these guys, trying to carry a message of hope to them, sharing with them what this is about, reading out of the big book. And on the way home that night from that meeting, the guy that came up to me and asked me to sponsor him that night and let me stay in his house for 90 days, I hadn't heard from this guy for 6 months. Calls me up on the phone just to see how I'm doing and let me know that he's still sober. And he's still sober today. This guy's like 5 months behind me. It's one of the things why I went to the suburban group in Austin for a long time, because at that group they didn't tell me I had to be sober for a year before I could sponsor people. They said, come on, we need you. And I got in there, and they showed me how to do this. I started going on my first 12-step calls. You know, guys, that's where the power of this thing's about, you know. I know that when I did those things at first, I did them because I wanted to stay sober. Now I do them because I love it. You know, my life is not perfect today, but it's better than it's ever been in my life. And you're not going to find me complaining about it. I'm pretty happy about what's going on in my life. It's a pretty cool deal. I have a job that I truly love. I've come, I certainly didn't envision myself moving to Ingram, Texas from Austin. You know, but I love it here. I got a room full of friends. I know almost everybody in this room, and if I don't know you, I'll be looking forward to getting to know you after this meeting. You know, God has blessed me. You know, they even got crackheads out in Ingram. What do you know? You know, well, what a cool deal. Because when they told me when I first came out here to Kerrville that I was going to have to go back to Austin and find Alcoholics Anonymous and Cocaine Anonymous, I was like, you guys don't understand. I don't think they do that in Austin. You know, I've lived there for like 20 years and I've never heard of it. But sure enough, I found there was a pretty big recovery group in Austin. And I found the same thing when I came back out here. And it's truly an honor to be part of this community. You know, whether I'm in Kerrville or whether I'm in Virginia, whether I'm in Austin, wherever I go, you know, because I've learned that this fellowship, it's a worldwide thing. I can find it anywhere as I go. And it's not just about meetings. You know, the book talks about that Alcoholics Anonymous meetings are not enough to bring about recovery. You know, I can find drunks no matter where I go. You know, I just carried a guy into detox today. You know, the world's full of them, an endless supply. You know, Bill Wilson talked about that even back then, that we're not even scratching the surface of what this deal is. But we are scratching the surface. You know, bless all you guys for being here tonight, and thanks you for letting me share.